All right, hello everyone, and welcome to my channel. It's uh, an educational channel, and thanks for tuning in today. Um, we are doing another Bible Decode today, number 321, and um, we've tried to focus on all kinds of biblical ciphers, things that you can use to understand your New Testament in particular. We'll get to the Old Testament soon enough, but understand your New Testament um, on a deeper level by using various codes and ciphers to um, dig a little bit more deeper uh, into the words there, and also just what is the Bible, where did it come from, who wrote it, when did they write it, why did they write it. These are questions that your pastor or priest don't want you to ask. They want you to say, this is the Word of God. And if you want to say that, you can say that, but I don't think you can really say that and still call yourself a truther, still call yourself interested in getting at the truth about anything. That's just a lazy way to kind of maintain the status quo. Um, and that requires faith. And when you have faith, it means that you do not have knowledge. And so, if you want to dig a little bit deeper and try to figure out just what is this thing that I'm reading here, I, I would grant you that it is important to read your Bible, but you need to know what your Bible is before you start reading it, at least a little bit, so that you kind of have an understanding of the general context that's involved. Um, and so we've been going over a lot of different ciphers, especially the Roman origins hypothesis, that is, that the Romans were the true authors of the New Testament, and they wrote it as a psychological operation against the Jews. We've also looked at the Dead Sea Scrolls and their comparisons with the New Testament. We've looked at mythological sources, mystery religions, Greek, Egyptian, Sumerian mythologies, and we've looked at entheogenic and pornographic ways of looking at it, and we're kind of coming back here to a little bit of the Roman origins, but more along the lines of a kind of a more sweeping view of, that this isn't just a situation that occurred between the Romans and the Jews. That's why, authors like Joseph Atwill will tell you that, you know, the motive for the Romans was to neutralize or to mollify, to tame or domesticate the Jews, who had been a big pain in the side of the Romans. And while all that's true, this author, Roman Piso, gets into like kind of a greater context of a much larger oligarchical psychological operation. He first starts with the basic caveat that all of the ancient documents, whether they're religious, historical, philosophical, poetic, astronomical, mathematical, legal, or whatever, they're all written by the royal families. The royal families and their representatives are the only people writing, all the way up until 500 or 600 years ago. And that they used a myriad of fake names, pen names, aliases, pseudonyms, in order to cover up that fact, to make it look like there was a big diversity of opinion, but it was really a very small cadre of people that were doing all of the writing. And this includes one of his ancestors named Arius Piso and his family from the powerful Piso family of ancient Rome, going all the way back to the beginning of ancient Rome. And they were big players in this first century milieu, and they were known as the Little Caesars at this time. So they were kind of rivals to the Julian Caesars, the ones who were the real Caesars, in name Caesar: Julius, Augustus, Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, and Nero, going from mid first century to mid first century BC to mid first century AD. Nero was assassinated in 68 AD, and Arius Piso wrote as so many of these different scholars that it is actually dizzying. And some of his children and grandchildren also took up the mantle, and they wrote as various authors as well. Not only the Gospels did Arius write, he also wrote as Josephus, and Josephus is the key work. His work, War of the Jews, is the key work that you need in order to understand the Gospels. You can understand that they were written by the same people at the same time for the same reason. And then when you understand that Josephus was a member of the Flavian dynasty of Caesars from 69 to 96 AD, then you can figure out who wrote the New Testament, which was written at the same time. Even though it was backdated, the story was backdated by 40 plus years. And there is ample evidence for all of this in some of the suppressed works that we've covered over the last several months. Joseph Atwill's Caesar's Messiah, Michael Menescott's Shakespeare, what's it called? Christianity's Origin as a Flavian Secrecy Cult. Henry Davis, Creating Christ, or Creating Christianity, and also Abelard Royklin's pamphlet that is called The True Authorship of the New Testament, which goes all the way back to 1979. And Roman Piso was an independent writer of Abelard Reuchlin, who came to the same conclusions. They eventually worked together for quite some time. And so he starts with that, that caveat that all of the ancient writings were written under pseudonyms, and that these pseudonyms can be decoded because they wrote for other royals. They were writing in kind of on two levels. One was to divert and or deceive the masses, and the other was to inform the other royals, not only of their identities, but of crucial information that is what they were trying to impart in whatever writing they had. So now Roman Piso has literally almost 200 articles up on ResearchGate that I've read most of them, and some of them are book length, some of them are very short. A lot of them are genealogical. The ones that are genealogical, I haven't read so much, but I'm just going over some of my notes, and he's very repetitive, kind of goes over the same territory a lot, kind of like I do, which is fine because I think you need the repetition. Everybody needs the repetition as far as all this goes, because some of the concepts are a little bit esoteric, and you know, sometimes I might say things 5 times, but in 5 different ways. But it's not till the 5th time that I say it that it kind of kicks in for you, like it hits the right nerve or whatever. So, and that I found that just in my studies, that repetition is pretty key to eventually trying to actually get it. So we are starting right here with one of his articles that is called Determining Ancient Identities and the True Nature of Ancient History. Now he says, it is evident that Arius Piso had written the prototype for the book of Revelation, because we find many of the exact terms used there as we do in his work. But it was his son Julius who wrote the finished product. Now Julius, by the time he wrote Revelation, he was kind of on the outs with the family. I believe he had fought valiantly in the Bar Kokhba Second Jewish War from 132 to 135 AD, and he was expecting to be the next emperor after Emperor Hadrian. But shortly before Hadrian died, he gave the emperorship to one of Arius Piso's grandsons, who can't remember his given name, but he became known as Emperor Antoninus Pius. He was also known as Pope Pius I, and he was also known as the historian Suetonius. That's how these things go. According to Arius Piso, these people all occupied a number of different names and a number of different personas, and they wrote everything. And Suetonius is the exact person that you need in order to kind of understand the book of Revelation, especially much of the imagery that's involved in the book of Revelation, because it reflects almost perfectly the chapter on Domitian in Suetonius' book 12 Emperors. What he sees in his throne room are the same images that are described in Revelation. Now, so when Julius was writing Revelation, he was hurt by the fact that he wasn't going to be the new emperor. I think he also wasn't into the whole psychological operation in the first place, and so he wrote it really as an expose or a revelation as to who actually did write this and why, without going too far. It all has to be kind of still in code. Now, Julius, I believe, was executed by Emperor Hadrian before Hadrian even died. So shortly after he wrote Revelation, which wasn't written until about 135 AD. This is all according to Roman Piso. Other scholars will tell you that Revelation was written much earlier. Now he's got a section here, or maybe this is a new article, regarding the Gospel of Mark. This was scholars even assent to the fact that Mark was the first gospel that was written, and that the other 2 synoptic gospels, Matthew and Luke, are kind of patterned after Mark, especially Matthew. Matthew is like 90% straight from Mark. And so this was the first gospel that the Romans worked on. According to Roman Piso, they formed a committee to create a new universal religion. The attempt was really to wipe out the Jewish religion. and replace it with this other thing. Because the Jews were just a big pain in the butt for the Romans to govern. They had this zealous, jealous, obsessive, compulsive, and arbitrary God, a psychopathic God that called them the chosen people, and they were living in this promised land, and they had all these rituals and strictures that they had to follow. And all these things were just very difficult for the Romans to deal with. The Romans wanted you to have freedom of religion, but the Romans wanted you to give Caesar what is Caesar's. And they wanted you to assimilate into the empire. And the Jews were xenophobic and separatist. And so they were constantly revolting and lashing out and insurrecting, causing terrorist attacks and assassinations, and more so than any other group of people that the Romans were ruling over. And so they pinned it down on to the Jewish religion and the Jewish traditions. And so they were really attempting to wipe those things out. So they started working on this book of Mark. And they put everything in there, talking about a universal religion. They had all the mythological stuff, the astrological stuff. They have mystery religions, Egyptian, Greek, Roman, concepts and philosophies, a lot of Greek cynicism and stoicism, and Roman, and they just put it all in there. And some of the people that were working on it, according to Roman Piso, were Seneca the Younger, the rhetorician, Lucius Calpurnius Piso, who was Arius's uncle, Vettius Paterculus, Lucan the poet, Gaius Calpurnius Piso, who was Arius Piso's father, and Petronius Arbiter. This was going way back into the reign of Tiberius in the 30s. So just after the time that Jesus was said to have lived. And they apparently had a little campus set up at the city of Tiberias, which I think is in Galilee. And they worked on it, but it was disbanded. I guess maybe at the end of Tiberius's reign. Caligula was the next emperor, and I don't think he was really too down for it. But he was only in there a little while. Then Claudius, but eventually Nero takes the throne in 54 AD, and they, I think only a couple of them, stayed working on it. But they pitched the idea to Nero. Nero was not in for it at all. He had a wife, Poppaea, who was very sympathetic to the Jews, apparently, and Nero said no, so they plotted Nero's assassination. The plot was discovered by Nero, and he had several of them executed, including Seneca the Younger, who was originally his tutor when Nero was a child, and Lucan was executed, and Gaius Piso, Arius's father, was also executed. This was in 65 AD. Eventually, revenge was taken by these conspirators, especially Arius Piso, and Nero himself was assassinated in 68 AD, leading into the Roman Civil War and the year of the four emperors. So then there was a quick succession of three emperors after Nero, Galba, Otho, and Vitellius, who were all made emperor, and then all assassinated in quick succession, leaving the floor to General Vespasian, who was fighting in this war against the Jews. Nero had sent him in there at 66 AD when the Jews revolted under a number of self-proclaimed Jewish messiahs who, were reflecting the times, which were filled with prophecies from the Old Testament that the Jews were waiting for that a Jewish Messiah was coming that was going to help them overthrow the Romans. And so when this really did happen, Nero sent in General Vespasian to quell the revolt. 3 years later, the war raged on, but Vespasian got the call to become the new emperor. He put his son Titus into the military commandership, and he went back to Rome to become the emperor. So now Titus then keeps fighting this war for another 4 years. He completely destroys Jerusalem and then eventually triumphs at the fortress a little bit further south called Masada, where all the Jews committed suicide rather than surrender to Titus. Okay, so that kind of sets up what he's talking about here. Once Vespasian, Titus, Lucius Piso, and Arius Piso, and Arius Piso was fighting alongside Titus here as well, and that kind of gave him the context and the understanding of the war that he needed to write his Jewish War, or the War of the Jews, in 7 volumes, which was written under the name of Josephus. And again, that's kind of the companion addition to the New Testament. So once Vespasian, Titus, Lucius Piso, and Arius Piso had destroyed the temple and Jerusalem in general, Lucius Piso and Arius were free to work on the Gospel of Mark and Matthew for a few years. I don't know exactly what happened, and I don't have any documentation of this, but according to Roman Piso, Lucius Piso was killed by Arius Piso, so he killed his own uncle while the two were in midst of a battle about the year 73 AD. So at the end of the war, somehow Lucius turned on his uncle and killed him. Not sure how that fits into the whole story. He then goes on in the war with the Jews. Arius Piso had considered Jesus the son of Gamaliel I. This is a different Jesus, the leader of the Pharisees, his ultimate enemy. Gamaliel was one of the revolutionaries, and so Jesus and Gamaliel were kind of two insurrectors, but this was before the real revolt had started. And Arius Piso killed both of them in 63 AD. And now he could use the name of his now dead enemy to help create his Messiah. So he used that name, Jesus, kind of to rub it in or mock the original Jesus and kind of erase his name from history. Now the Christ, a term which originated from an ancestor of Arius Piso called Mithridates Crestus. In Mark, Arius Piso secretly calls himself Satan as well. Now you have to remember, or you have to know, that in addition to creating the character of Jesus Christ in the New Testament, the Romans also created the character of Satan. Satan did not exist in the Old Testament in the way that he exists in the New Testament. Satan is discussed in a few locations in the Old Testament, but each time Satan is like a human. It is an obstacle or an adversary. Now, we think of Satan, Satan has been imputed into the New Testament in a number of places, like the snake in the Garden of Eden is seen as being Satan, and many of the competing gods to Yahweh are seen as being Satan, like Baal or Shamash or um, what's the other one? There's Baphomet. There's another one. Baphomet is a later thing, but there's another another one of these competing gods to Yahweh, who kind of also gets the tag of Satan, but that's just made up. That's not in the text. The only text that has Satan refers to a human, and I think in one case it actually refers to King David. And so this concept of this supernatural Satan who has these great powers is strictly created by the Romans and then accentuated over time through literature. People like Dante and John Milton in particular kind of amplified the power of Satan. And then in the 20th century, Hollywood gives us our images of Satan. And I'm sure there's a lot of artwork and sculptures and so on that also kind of form that image of Satan throughout the Christian Europe. But this is just as much of an invention of the Romans as Jesus is. So, you know, really Satan is really kind of like the alter ego of Jesus, and it's a result of kind of this exorcism of God, because God, Yahweh, in the God with a small g, God, the Yahweh God of the Old Testament, the Yahweh God really plays the role of Satan. He is the destroyer. You know, he's the one that destroys people and kills hundreds of thousands of people at one blow if he gets mad, and he's very arbitrary and capricious in the way he metes out death and destruction, and you know, kills his own people if they disobey. You know, sometimes just you know, looking the wrong way, or you know, like Lot's wife turns back and he turns her into a pillar of salt. So God is really taking that role of Satan, and he's being cleansed in the New Testament. And so now we have these two separate characters that come out of God, maybe three if you include the Holy Spirit. But then you've got Jesus, who's kind of the good side, and Satan, who's the bad side. And they both have supernatural powers. So these are things that have been gone over by some scholars. There's a book out there that is called The Birth of Satan. I believe Elaine Pagels has a book on the creation of Satan. But it's worth you know, looking at your New Testament and seeing that, you know, that the concept of Satan, the actual word Hasatan or something in Hebrew is quite different than the character that moves up into the New Testament. But apparently, Arius Piso secretly calls himself Satan. He plays. Now, these Gospels were written by the Pisos as plays to be performed in front of the illiterate masses and to be barnstormed all around the empire. And so Arius Piso, when they're writing them, they're writing themselves into the plays as actors. So Arius Piso writes himself in as Jesus, but he also writes himself in as Satan. He writes himself in as God. He also writes himself in as Peter once Jesus is crucified, so that he always has a role. He writes his children in as the various disciples. He writes his mother in as Mary. And so he calls himself Satan in honor of one of his ancestors, Antigonus Gonatas. And Gonatas is Gonatas, Satan spelled backwards. You know, that could be a stretch, you know, that could just be a coincidence, but that's apparently what Arius Piso is going with. So he does much of this by putting, he shows a lot of this stuff by putting the information out of context. That's a lot of how you can decode the New Testament and Josephus. Whenever they're talking about something that seems irrelevant, or an aside, or just when they repeat the same thing twice, or when they say something that doesn't quite fit with the rest of the text, that is pretty much showing you that it's in code. There's not any wasted language in either Josephus or the New Testament, but especially in the New Testament. It's chock full of propagandistic literature, writing. And so if it doesn't make sense with the narrative, it's there for a reason. It's not like the author just lost their train of thought and went off on a tangent. It's there for a reason. And so that's kind of how you can also decode the New Testament. Whenever it seems like they're not talking about anything that's relevant to the actual narrative of the story, it's in code. You have to decode it. And so he does a lot of the Satan stuff by putting the information out of context. And he does the same thing with disclaimers that he places in the Gospels. So he gives an example of Mark 1:7. Who is he that comes mightier than I? And it says, the Piso is me. He uses the Greek omicron in front of his name, Opiso, O-P-I-S-O. And I believe that means behind, if I'm not mistaken. And uses words like after, before, or behind to give his name Piso in general. So the O as a word is the. So when he says O Piso, it could mean it could mean the Piso. It also could mean behind. And so however it interchanges with A, therefore it can also be seen as the initial A for Arius, which renders Arius Piso or A Piso. Of course, this is all in the original Greek Testament. He points at verses that are similar: Mark 1:17, Mark 1:20, Mark 2:16, Mark 3:23, Mark 4:15, Mark 8:29, Mark 8:33. An example: Jesus rebukes Peter. Peter, Legion, get me. I am the Piso, Satan, and thou God. That's, I think, Mark 8:34. He also points at Mark 6:37, Mark 12:15, and Mark 14:5. Now, Julius Piso, the author of Revelation, also used the same technique, along with other items, to point to his father as Arius Piso. Okay. Now we're into an entirely different article, The Beginnings of Christianity and the Evolution of the Popes. The first bishop of Rome to publicly call himself Papa, or Pope, as a title, was Damascus I, Pope, from 366 to 384 AD. And, you know, according to Roman Piso, the whole stunt of all the barnstorming tours that this Arius Piso and family went on, none of it really worked. It didn't get off the ground. Christianity did not become popular. And so for over 2 centuries, the Piso family kept writing and kept that the really Christianity was really just on paper. It was all writing, pretending that something was going on. All the writing of the church fathers, who were all related to the Pisos, and the bishops of Rome or popes, who were also all in line with the Pisos. We went over like the first 10 bishops of Rome about 2 or 3 days ago. So it wasn't until Constantine in the early 4th century that the Romans overtly got into interfering with the Christian religion and to kind of legalize it or endorse it, and then it became this mandatory state religion later in the 4th century. Now, when they created the illusion of the Roman Empire falling, fall of the Roman Empire kind of replaced by the Byzantium Empire, the Roman Empire of the East, that's in Istanbul, Turkey, which is now in Turkey. So they created the illusion of the Roman Empire falling. It actually just moved to the east. Other branches of the family emerged on the scene. These were known in history as really the barbarians, the Lombards, the Visigoths, the Franks. These are all like these barbarian hordes that were roaming around Europe in the Dark Ages. And so these were all related to the Piso family as well. They were closely related to the leaders of the Franks, who would become known as the Merovingians of France. That's Charlemagne and so on in the 8th century. These leaders could all trace back their ancestries to Arius Piso. And he's got genealogy articles on this. I'm not really qualified to know, and I'm not don't have time at this point in my life to do the digging to figure out whether he's fudging these genealogies or not, but he does have articles out there if you have the inclination to dig into them. I'd love to hear what you have to come up with. When it came to choosing a pope and someone to replace or succeed him, the various branches of family would decide by committee. And there were a lot of committees that went on there in the Roman Church, to decide what part of the Gospels to get rid of, and so on and so forth. Maybe we'll get into a little bit more of that tomorrow. I think I'm going to stop right here. And we'll talk about a little bit about the popes tomorrow. And we're trying to do Bible decodes, so this stuff is quite tangential, but so I might omit this, but it does also provide insight into the scope of this conspiracy, and that it isn't just confined to the Romans and the Jews in the 1st century, that it has real world applications that have been evident throughout the last 2,000 years, all the way up into the present day. Many of our politicians that are active now are claimed to be distant descendants of the Piso family as well. All right, like, share, subscribe. Thanks for tuning in today. Have a wonderful day. See you tomorrow.